Well, brethren, we are at the beginning of a new year as the world calculates time, as the secular society around us has observed just a week ago, the New Year's Day. It is, I think, appropriate that from time to time we step back and look a little bit at the world in which we live and at what is going on in the world around us. And sometimes at the beginning of a new year is a good time to step back and look at what has happened, what is happening, and what is going to happen, because as we're told right here in the book of Isaiah chapter 46, God says in Isaiah 46 verse 9, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure." The latter part of verse 11, he says, "I have spoken it, I will bring it to pass, I have purposed it, and I will also do it." God declares the end from the beginning. And we're living in a world that is beset with many wide-ranging events. The world in which we have lived and the world around us has undergone many dramatic changes in recent years, and it is certainly experiencing a great deal of change and transition. God declares the end from the beginning. You know, it's not a mystery to God what's going on. We live in a world where a lot of things are happening. And prophecy is shaping up. Events are taking place on the world scene that we need to understand. We need to understand the implications of those events for our lives and the lives of our families and our loved ones, our friends and our neighbors, in the weeks and months and years immediately ahead of us. Because we live in significant times, in times that a great deal of things are going on, things that are very important. And God is working a great master plan out here below. He says that He declares the end from the beginning. And He's working a great master plan out on this earth. And it is something that we need to understand and that we can understand, something in which we can have and have been called to have an important part. The Bible focuses in on 5 major areas of Bible prophecy. 5 major areas that Bible prophecy focuses on, and events of great significance are taking place in all of those areas. Things that we need to understand. Bible prophecy focuses in on Europe and the events that are taking place in Europe. We're going to come back and pick up on that a little bit. Bible prophecy focuses in on Europe and the things that are going on there and the events that are going to take place there that will shape events in the rest of the world. Bible prophecy focuses in on the United States and British Commonwealth nations in a very special way, and events that are taking place there, and events that will astonish and amaze people all over the world when these things come about. The Scripture talks about that our name will be an astonishment. What will happen here will be an astonishment to people all over the world. So Bible prophecy focuses in on the events in the United States and British Commonwealth nations. Bible prophecy focuses in on the events in the Middle East. The events going on in the Middle East, and don't kid yourself that all of a sudden great peace is breaking out in the Middle East. Great peace. Well, you know, the Scripture says great peace have those that love thy law. And so you know how much peace is breaking out all over. Just look around and see how many people love God's law. And when everybody loves God's law, there'll be great peace. Because great peace have all they that love thy law. You know, you look around, you don't find a whole lot of people that really love God's law a whole lot. They don't have a whole lot of peace, and there's not a lot of peace in the Middle East. And the pact that was signed between Yasser Arafat and the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Rabin, is not the solution. to the events in the Middle East. And of course, that's been apparent. There's been ongoing strife and difficulty. But the Middle East and some very significant events that are talked about, Bible prophecy focuses in on Jerusalem and on the Middle East. The Bible prophecy focuses in on the Catholic Church and the role that it will play in the months and years immediately ahead of us. The events that certainly tie in even with the Middle East and with Europe. It's not coincidental, and it's not simply incidental that the Vatican recently signed a pact with Israel, granting diplomatic recognition and the exchange of envoys that the State of Israel had with the Vatican. It has put the Vatican in a position of being involved in the Middle East, and specifically in Jerusalem and the events there that are going to prove to be very significant. And one final area that is overlooked and that the world does not understand at all in terms of Bible prophecy is Bible prophecy focuses in on the Church of God and on events that will happen and transpire involving the very people of God. And that is something that, again, we can look at and see. And I think we have gone through and experienced some things that ought to make us realize even more vividly some of these prophecies and their implications for us. You know, all of these areas, and we can't, we could spend a series of sermons on all of them, and this is not going to be a 5-part sermon or something else. It's going to be a 1-part sermon, so we're going to just focus in on some of the highlights of each of these areas, because obviously the amount of detail that we could go into, we could spend in various facets of all of it. But in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, we find that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. And it was a dream that left him troubled, because he didn't clearly remember what he had dreamed, but he knew that it was significant, it was unusual, and it left him bothered, and he was troubled, and he couldn't figure it out. And so he called for the soothsayers, for the magicians, for the sorcerers, for the so-called wise men of Babylon. And he told them, I have had a dream. Now the dream has gone from me. I don't really remember clearly what it was I dreamed, but I know it was significant, and I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. And they said, now wait a minute. Nobody can do that. Now if you'll tell us the dream, we'll tell you what it meant. Well, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a total dummy. He began to figure out, well, wait a minute. If they're going to be inspired to know the true meaning of this dream, the same source that inspires them to know the true meaning of the dream ought to be able to inspire them to know what the dream is. Now, if I were to tell them the dream, well, they could tell me anything that was the meaning, and I wouldn't know whether it was or not. So then he began to get mad. And he said, look, I want you to tell me what I dreamed and what it meant. And if you don't, I'm going to chop you up in little pieces. He was a guy that sort of given to losing his temper, he was really ready to, when he got upset, he was ready. We're told in verse 12 that he was furious. He was angry and very furious. He commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And he was going to do this. In fact, on several occasions you find that he was ready to chop people up in little pieces, tear their house down, and make their house a dunghill. So this was his favorite punishment. This is what he was going to do when he got mad at somebody. And Daniel, word got to Daniel. Daniel was sort of classed in that category, even though Daniel wasn't that. He wasn't really a part of their system, but he was sort of classed in as one of the wise men. And when he got the news, he said, oh, wait a minute. Let me go in and talk to the king. I don't want to get chopped up with all these fellas. So he went in and came to the king, and he said, look, in verse 28, he told Nebuchadnezzar, he said, there is a God in heaven, that reveals secrets, and that makes known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Your dream and your visions of your head upon your bed are these. As for you, O king, your thoughts came into your mind upon your bed, what should come to pass hereafter. He that reveals secrets makes known to you what shall come to pass. Daniel said, you were right, king. You were right that the dream you had is significant. Now, I'm going to tell you what it was and what it meant. Not because I'm so smart, not because I'm so great of and by myself, but there is a God in heaven. There is a real God. There is a God in heaven, and that God reveals secrets. And He is making known to you through this dream what shall happen in the latter days. That's what it says right here. It didn't say He's making known to you what's going to happen next year or next month or day after tomorrow. It didn't say He's making known to you what's going to happen, in a little while. He said He's making known to you what shall happen in the latter days. So here was a dream that had great prophetic significance. It was given to make known what should come to pass in the latter days. Prophecy is important. God inspired these things to be written down and preserved. Nebuchadnezzar was given this dream. And it wasn't just for Nebuchadnezzar, because it was recorded and made part of the Bible. And if the only point of this was to prove that God could reveal secrets, you wouldn't even have to go on with the story as to what the dream was and what it meant. We could just have, this first part of the story that we've read and the statement made, and so Daniel told him what it meant, and Daniel told him the dream, told him what it meant. No, this is given to demonstrate that there is something that is being revealed that is important, and it is important for the latter days. He told him in verse 31, You saw, O king, a great image. You saw this great image upon a plain. And it was brilliant. It shined. It radiated. And it was an awesome, impressive image. The head of this image was of gold. The shoulders and the chest were of silver. The belly and the thighs were of brass. The legs were of iron. And the feet were a rather odd combination of iron mixed with miry clay. An iron and ceramic mixture, which gave sort of an unusual appearance. And it, of course, created something that was unusual. It created something that does not bond together. If you had had two of the metals, they would have bonded together. You could have melted them and put them together. The iron and the clay does not bond. Oh, it may, for a little while, this mixture of iron and clay, but it doesn't bond together. It is something that can be easily separated into clearly definable parts. So he said, you saw all of this, and then you saw a stone cut out without hands. It wasn't a stone that originated with a human being sort of carving it and cutting it. A stone cut out without hands comes down from heaven and smashes this image on the toes. And the whole thing turns to dust and blows away. And the stone becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. Now, if you had a dream like that, you'd probably be perplexed as well. Well, that's an odd dream. Daniel told him, he said, this is what you dreamed. Now I'm going to tell you the interpretation of it, because this dream has significance. He said in verse 37, You, O king, are a king of kings. You are the ruler of a great empire. And there are other lesser kings who hold office under you. You are the ruler of a great empire. The God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So he reminded the king, he said, what you have comes from God. God allows you to hold sway over this vast area of the known civilized world. In the latter part of verse 38, he said, you are this head of gold. Okay, we're going to understand now this image. Here, the overview of the empires, the civilizations of mankind. An overview of mankind's governments from a biblical perspective. We're given right here, beginning at the time of Nebuchadnezzar on down till the end time. So we start with Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire are represented by this head of gold. In verse 39, Daniel told him, after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, and it will break in pieces and subdue all the others. Now, what we find is a continuation. Historically, we see that continuation. In fact, the first part of it is recorded for us right here in the book of Daniel in the historical sections. Because after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, on a number of years later, about 70 years after these prophecies were being given, or a little less than 70 years after this was being given, you find that we have an event recorded in the book of Daniel, which was an invasion by the Medes and the Persians coming into Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, saw the handwriting on the wall. You remember the story. And the Medes and the Persians came in and conquered Babylon. And the empire of the Medes and the Persians held sway. That was the second kingdom. That was the kingdom that arose afterward. That was in certain ways inferior to the Babylonian Empire, and yet it ruled a great area. Ruled a great empire. That empire held sway for about 2 centuries. The empire of the Medes and the Persians. And then there arose a third empire, a third kingdom that arose in the west, up in the areas of northern Greece, the area of Macedonia, right, frankly, near where some of the fighting is going on in the Balkans. A man by the name of Philip of Macedon united the Greek peninsula under his rulership, and his son, who is known to history as Alexander the Great, was his successor and took this united Greek nation, crossed into what is now the modern-day nation of Turkey, ancient Asia Minor, crossed there and began an invasion across to the east. And within 2 centuries of the fall of Babylon, just over 2 centuries of the fall of Babylon, the empire of the Medes and the Persians had fallen. Alexander the Great defeated the empire of the Medes and the Persians and established himself, ensconced himself in power for a period of a very few years. And by the time he was about 30 years of age, he died. And yet he had brought the whole known world, established an empire that stretched all the way to India, under the influence of Greek language, Greek religion, Greek culture. And he established a great empire that dominated the Middle East. And even after his death and the empire divided up among several of his generals, Greek language, Greek culture was a unifying force in the whole known world, and certainly in the Mediterranean world and in the Middle East for a period of centuries. There arose then a fourth empire in the West, in Rome, that came and conquered each of those. One of the interesting things is, as you notice, each of these empires arises a little further to the west and a little further to the west. The empire begins the transformation into an empire that is more based in the west. Many of these peoples were in the process eventually of migrating sort of to the north and to the west. The Middle East was the cradle of civilization, and as time progressed, that center of civilization moved more and more to Europe. The fourth kingdom that arose, and clearly historically, the Roman Empire, which swallowed up the remains of Alexander's empire, that broke in pieces everything else, the great powerful legions of Rome that broke in pieces and shattered all opposition everywhere. As one leader, one Scottish leader who faced the Roman armies shortly after the time of Christ, had to conclude very bitterly. He says, the Romans came, they made a desert, and they called it peace. The Romans had that brutality, that force of iron. And if they had to make a desert in order to call it peace, they would. And much of what they did, that was the way they did it. A fourth kingdom, strong as iron, that held sway. Now, the two legs of the empire, the two legs of the image, were symbolic of the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire, in a very special way, was divided into the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine was responsible for that division. He named Constantinople after himself and made that the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, with Rome remaining the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Originally divided for administrative purposes, eventually the empires came to function more and more independently, even though in theory they were linked together and were a part of one empire, yet in reality and in practice they became more and more clearly distinct. Prophecy through the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation traces the successions in the Western Roman Empire. But there was a continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire as well. The Eastern Roman Empire, known historically as in latter periods of history as the Byzantine Empire, continued on down until the 1450s, when it finally collapsed, was overrun by the Turks about 40 years before Columbus discovered America. Now, it didn't just cease when that happened, because there was a man who viewed himself as the successor of the Eastern Caesars. He was married to the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and he viewed himself as the successor to the Eastern Caesars, and he was crowned as the new Caesar of the East. The title was pronounced Tsar. He had previously been the Grand Duke of Muscovy, the Grand Duke of Moscow. Now he became the Tsar, the Caesar of all the Russias. Moscow became known as the Third Rome. Rome, of course, having been the first Rome, Constantinople having been considered the second Rome. Now Moscow was the third Rome. And the succession of the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire continued down in the Slavic, Greek-dominated, Orthodox Slavic realms of the East, with the emperor or the Tsar of the Russians as the one that was the sort of the pivotal one there in the East. Just as in the West, the details we have in Bible prophecy of the ups and downs, the revivals. That's why as you come down through the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, all the way up into the early 20th century, there were two men in Europe who laid claim to both being the successor of Caesar. You had the Caesars of the East, the Tsars in Russia, and you had the Caesars in the West, the Kaisers in the German realm. That was the term that was used for the Holy Roman Emperors. We refer to them as Holy Roman Emperors, but the term in German was, they referred to them as the Kaisers, the Roman Kaisers. Kaiser was just simply the Germanic form of Caesar, as the Tsar was the Russian form of Caesar. And the Caesars in the West, continuing down, and Bible prophecy details only that portion of the empire that was dominated by the woman. In Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, that's the part that Bible prophecy focuses on. But we need to take note here because we have a continuation down. We have 2 legs that eventually end in 2 feet, 10 toes. Which means that you have nations from the east and nations from the west that will be part of that final 10-nation revival. These final 10 kings, 10 nations, 10 leaders. You see, we come on down here that in verse 44, in the days of these kings, speaking of the final 10, symbolized by the 10 toes, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. See, the God of heaven is going to smash that final system. And it'll turn to dust, and the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Now, what we have is a situation that has been developing increasingly. We used to wonder a number of years ago, how, with the circumstance of a strong, powerful Soviet Union, how would Germany ever be allowed to reunite? And how would some of the nations that were so behind the so-called Iron Curtain ever be able to be part of that final system? How would the Soviet Union allow such a thing? Some of the very parts of the Soviet Union itself. How could such a thing be? And we were perplexed because we couldn't imagine how, though we saw clearly that that was to happen. In this sequence that I have gone through and given you, I could give you tapes of sermons I gave back in Houston, Texas, and earlier, going through the exact same sequence. Way back in the 70s. And it's not some new thing. But you know, we have a lot better idea now, because there were a matter of weeks in 1989 that totally changed the map of post-World War II Europe. And in the aftermath of that, the Soviet Union is no more. It has broken up into many constituent states, none of which, not even Russia, is powerful enough and cast a long enough shadow to be able to really put a stop to some of these things. Incredible things have happened. When God's time comes for events to occur, those events can happen so rapidly and so dramatically that it will literally make our heads swim. We can go along week after week and month after month, and it can seem that all things just continue along and nothing very dramatic is happening and everything is sort of going along, and all of a sudden, boom! God's time comes. Now, you and I don't know exactly when God's time is going to be for the next dramatic series of events. But I think we should have seen from the way things happened back in 1989 that when God's time comes, things can happen oh so quickly. The tendency of human nature is to think, well, you know, we'll see it. It'll be obvious, and we'll see it. We'll know it way in advance. We've got plenty of time. Yeah, there were a lot of people that thought that all the prophecies about the Laodicean church were so clear that they would certainly recognize that when it came on the scene, too. They read all these prophecies about people being deceived and said, well, you know, of course I'll never be deceived because, you know, I understand the truth. We've known that. We've heard that. People have read back about the Israelites and how, you know, in a matter of a few years, in a matter of a generation, they got off the track. Went into paganism. We thought, boy, that's horrible. Boy, if I'd been back there, I would have certainly never done a thing like that. People read the story of Israel and 40 years in the wilderness and the ups and downs during the period of the judges and think, boy, that's incredible. These people had a righteous judge and a righteous leader came along and he delivered them, got them on the track, went along. 40 years later, they were off the track. Brethren, it doesn't take 40 years to get off the track. Sometimes it doesn't even take 4 years. Incredible. We've read these things. It's so easy to think, well, yeah, I'll recognize it. I'll see it. Well, will we? There are keys to doing so. But we find events shaping up in Europe. It's no accident. There is turmoil. There is unrest. There was an interesting article came out, a little publication put out by the German Information Center, and quoting German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, he said, in the future as well, German unity and European unity remain two sides of the same coin. German unity and European unity, two sides of the same coin. There is an instability that is taking place, and that Europe is in transition. You have to understand that the situation that exists right now, and it is an unstable situation. From the time of the end of World War II, and is within a period of about 3.5 years or so in the aftermath of World War II, the post-war era emerged, the Iron Curtain that Joseph Stalin rung down on Eastern Europe, that appeared to be the permanent order of things for a period of about 40 years. And then it rusted. It's been rusting all along, but, it never appeared to be so until it was like it just began to crumble and dissipate within weeks. And disappeared. And the whole post-World War II era disappeared because Europe, we had what's called a bipolar world. In other words, Moscow and Washington were the two dominant poles, and everything was decided one place or the other, and Europe was divided between those who were allied with Moscow and those that were allied with Washington. And these were the two dominant powers. And everybody else had to sort of fit in. That is no longer the case. And increasingly that is apparent. And yet the Germans, which are right in the heart of Europe, and have been at the heart of some of these changes, are finding themselves in an increasingly difficult situation. They, right now, are experiencing the highest rate of unemployment in post-war German history. October unemployment in Germany was over 3.5 million. The highest unemployment that Germany has experienced since the end of World War II. There are economic problems and there is instability throughout Eastern Europe. Many of you have heard of the radical nationalist in Russia who has been elected to Parliament, and a number of people allied with him have been elected. The tendency of many is to just dismiss this guy as a clown, some sort of a kook. But of course, there were a lot of people that dismissed Hitler as a clown and a kook. He went around making a lot of outrageous statements too. He even wrote some crazy book, on my struggle, and he was talking in that book about the final solution of the Jewish problem. People thought that's nuts. Just a matter of years, they realized he may have been nuts. But he dragged the rest of the world into an insanity known as World War II. Now, just because somebody's nuts, that doesn't disqualify a person for national leadership. I think we have enough record of history to know by now that being nuts is not an automatic disqualification to be a world leader. We've had too many world leaders that fit that category. I'm not saying this fellow, this extreme nationalist in Russia, is going to prove to be anything more than a flash in the pan. And time will tell. I think there are some things that obviously will be involved, and one of which, of course, is the fact of really pushing the government in Moscow. It's a matter that every action produces an equal and opposite reaction. You know, an action produces a reaction. There's going to be response in the rest of Europe and in Russia, with Yeltsin and the various ones. There is this continuing turmoil. Europe finds itself in a very difficult dilemma. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe stood at a pinnacle of world power. Virtually every parcel and piece of the globe was dominated by Europe. European power was at a high. And within a very short time, Europe was plunged into a bloodbath that left the whole continent in disorder, in upheaval, in chaos, in catastrophe. It was ignited by a spark down in the Balkans. You see, the century opened with trouble in the Balkans, and the century is ending with trouble in the Balkans. It was an assassin's bullet fired in Sarajevo. There's a lot of bullets being fired in Sarajevo today. There was an assassin's bullet fired in Sarajevo in 1914 that ignited World War I. And Europe was plunged into a conflagration that dwarfed anything they had ever experienced before. We don't really relate to World War I in quite that way in the United States because it had not nearly the same impact here. The casualty loss and the deaths of people in World War I in the United States was very minor by comparison to other things. The United States had been involved in a war, the war between the states fought 50 years earlier, that had resulted in many times more deaths of Americans. And so, in terms of devastation, in terms of impact on a national psyche, that had far more impact. World War I came along, and we lost some men, but it was very minor by comparison to what we had lost 50 years earlier during the war between the states. Very minor by comparison to what we lost years later in World War II. But that was not the case in Europe. In France, in Britain, in Russia, in Germany, millions upon millions of the finest flower of a whole generation lay dead on the battlefields. They experienced losses that so far surpassed anything that the United States experienced that there's no comparison. Millions of people. There were over 10 million deaths, battlefield deaths, virtually all of them European. 10 million battlefield deaths in World War I. And about that number of civilians that died in World War I and its immediate aftermath. You know, part of the World War I is part of what allowed the Russian Revolution to take place, the communists to take over in Russia. It broke up and broke up old empires and remade the map of Europe. And Europe was economically devastated. Their terrain was devastated. So much was devastated. Germany was in a very unstable situation in the 1920s, the so-called Weimar Republic, that allowed someone like Adolf Hitler to finally come to power in 1933. And we have a situation when there is great instability. So here, World War I is over. There is all of this turmoil, all of this instability. The situation doesn't get settled out. Men like Mussolini and Hitler rise to power, and within 21 years, Europe is plunged once more into war, this time far dwarfing World War I. You know, World War I, when it was originally fought, it wasn't called World War I. You know, nobody was looking forward to some future war. They didn't say, well, this is World War I. They said, this is the Great War. This is the war to end all wars. That's what it was called, war to end all wars. We're now 75 years downstream from the end of that war to end all wars, and we have seen more people die in that 75 years, more human beings die in battle and through violence than all the rest of human history put together. So it was definitely not the war to end all wars. It plunged the world into World War II, which absolutely devastated Europe. Loss of life on a tremendous level, civilian and military, ushered in the post-war world where Europe found now its decisions being made in Moscow and Washington. From having been at a pinnacle of world power and controlling the events that happened all over the world, now Europe found itself absolutely being controlled by the Americans in the West and the barbarians in the East as they looked upon it. And they chafed under it for over 40 years until the post-World War II era, the post-World War II world dismantled and disentangled itself and just sort of collapsed. And now we are in a period of instability. We're in a period where there is economic problems, there is unrest, there is strife in many of these nations. Europe is frightened. They are frightened of finding themselves being drawn into the very kind of bloodbath that's going on in the Balkans right now. That here they have spent a century recovering, or 3/4 of a century recovering from World War I. Because World War II was really just the aftermath of World War I. It was the second act of the same thing. They've spent 3/4 of a century trying to recover. Now, finally, particularly the Western nations, having recovered a degree of power and influence and economic prosperity, and at least economic control of much of the rest of the world, if not direct political control, to where once again Europe counts, and now they find themselves teeter-tottering on the brink of losing it. And it is a frightening scenario that they face. Those things are very real to them because they live where those events transpired. For us, it's something we read of that happened a long ways away. Of course, there were those who directly went through it and fought in it, and it's more real to them. But Americans have tended to sort of look at world history as beginning in 1945, and that is not the case. So we see a great deal of foment that is going on in Europe. We see right now in our own nation things that are directly prophesied in Amos chapter 3. Amos chapter 3 and verse 9, it says, "Publish in the palaces in Ashdod, and in the palaces in the land of Egypt, and say, Assemble yourselves upon the mountains of Samaria, and behold the great tumults in the midst thereof, and the oppressions in the midst thereof." Oh, talking about the modern Israel, talking about Israel, the house of Israel, which Samaria was the capital. It says, look at the great tumults, the great civil strife and unrest. Do we have any civil strife and unrest in our country? You remember the Los Angeles riots? We're going to have increasing civil strife, increasing tumults, turmoil and turbulence, all sorts of oppressions. So I'll say oppressions. Most people are scared to walk down the streets in virtually any major city in this nation. That's oppression. You can't even go about your business in a normal way without being scared some thug's going to come out and shoot you. We live, there's tumult, there's chaos, right in our own nation's capital. The very capital of the nation is the most violence-ridden place virtually in this whole country. Just riddled with violence and chaos and confusion. Well, we could go on in all sorts of places right here. As you go on through in Amos chapter 6, it talks about, in verse 1, woe to them that are at ease in Zion, and trust in the mountains of Samaria, which are named chief of the nations, to whom the house of Israel came. Well, they've got confidence. Aren't we the chief of the nations? Aren't we a great, big, powerful nation? Why, they're at ease. They're relaxed. They're at rest. Nothing can happen to us. So he talks about in verse 3, you that put away the evil day and cause the seed of violence to come near. Oh, you think it's a way off somewhere, and in reality, you're bringing it closer and closer by your actions. Lie upon the beds of ivory and stretch themselves upon the couches and eat the lambs of the flocks and the calves in the midst of the stall, that chant to the sound of the viol, or in other words, that quaver to the sound of the stringed instruments, invent to themselves instruments of music. Verse 6, drink wine by the bowlful, and anoint themselves with the chief ointments. But they're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Oh, they're out boozing it up and partying. They're all involved in their music and they're boozing it up. Their drunkenness. Sodom. We're proud of it. We broadcast it. A horrible thing. There's no sense of shame. They're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. They're not really bothered and broken up when they see this whole nation disintegrating. Brethren, no people can be strong and can be powerful when they're rotted from within with moral decay. Economic problems and moral and spiritual problems go hand in hand together. 3 of the 10 commandments have direct economic implications. Don't steal, don't lie, and don't covet. That's pretty direct economic implications. Just imagine the impact on the economy if nobody stole anything. I'm not talking about just the guy that robs the 7-Eleven and runs off with $50. I'm talking about some of the great smart guys with the computers. They're not out there with a mask and a gun trying to steal a few cartons of cigarettes. No, they're wiping out millions of dollars, and moving it around and manipulating and doing all sorts of machinations. Just imagine the impact on the economy. Nobody stole. No shoplifting. No white-collar theft. No armed robbery. No theft. No business had to allow for the loss of anything through theft. And, people weren't stealing from their employers by carting off things. Be like the guy that used to come out of the yard every day pushing a wheelbarrow with a cover on top of it, and every day they'd check him at the gate, and they'd look under there and they'd check, and they couldn't find anything, and this went on for years, and they just knew that he was they just knew he was stealing something, but they couldn't figure out what it was. Finally, time came for him to retire, and the guy said at the gate said, "Look, I know you've been stealing things for years." And he said, "We've tried everything we could to catch you. What have you been stealing?" The guy said, "Wheelbarrows." So, all kinds of things. Things that are carted right out under people's noses, and things that are stolen from businesses, and things that are manipulated and maneuvered. Just think of the impact on the economy if nobody stole. Think about the impact on the economy if nobody lied. Well, that'd shut down a lot of lawyers right off. That's a drain on the economy. Shut down for a variety of reasons. A lot of most of the civil litigation that takes place in this country comes because somebody lied. They agreed to do something. They said, yes, if this happens, we will pay this. Or if that happens, we will do this. They made a contract. It might involve insurance. It might involve whatever. It involved an agreement. Something happens, and they don't want to do what they said. They're trying to weasel out of it because it's going to cost them some money, and so they don't want to do it. And so they haggle and they fight, and some of you have been even involved in some of those things, where maybe an injury or maybe some problem or something and just drag on in court. Why? Because people can't be counted on to keep their word. Imagine what a drain that is on the economy, often useless ways, because people just lie. Think what that would do to advertising. Can you imagine if you couldn't lie, what it would be like to try to write a cigarette ad? Marlboro Country, here they are, riding out. They just show the cancer ward of the VA hospital, some poor old guy laying up there with a trach tube coming out his throat. Label that Marlboro Country. Sad, tragic. What about covetousness? So much of the modern economy is kept going on trying to incite people to covetousness, trying to encourage people to buy what they don't need and can't afford because somebody else has it, and if they've got it, you need to have it too. And besides, your version is old and outmoded. It came out 6 months ago, and we've got the new and improved version. So you need to junk your old one and get our new and improved version. It washes whiter than white. The last soap powders you got only washed white, but ours washes whiter than white. I don't know how whiter than white is. That's pretty white, I guess. But each one is new and improved, and somehow the other one, which was the best thing that ever came down the pike, all of a sudden that's junk. It's crazy when you think about it. But ultimately, you're getting back to moral and spiritual laws. Just direct commandments from God. When a nation is geared to greed and covetousness and lying and stealing and manipulating and maneuvering and everybody trying to undercut someone else what can be the consequences? It's like rot and decay. You can have a floor that maybe is nice and polished and you keep it mopped and clean and waxed. And you got termites eating away at the sills down underneath. Boy, they eat the thing all the way through, and then pretty soon this nice shiny floor begins to sag. And one day you walk along and put your foot somewhere, and it goes all the way through. It's been rotted and eaten out from underneath. You can keep it polished to a shine where you can see your face from the top. But if it's rotted and decayed from underneath, it's going to collapse. And we can have all the glitter and the glamour that is available. But there is a moral rot and decay in our nation. And that is going to produce consequences and collapse. And God prophesied of those things. We could go on. We could go on to the Middle East and look at the events that are happening there. There are some very pronounced things that are taking place. In Daniel chapter 12, there's an interesting statement. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11, we're told, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate set up, shall be 1,290 days, 1,290 days." So here is an event that is going to occur. Now, we find here in Daniel chapter 12, it talks about a period of 1,260 days, a period of 1,290 days, a period of 1,335 days. And Daniel is told in verse 13, "Go your way till the end be, for you shall rest." Daniel was going to die and sleep in the earth. "You shall rest and stand in your lot at the end of the days." So Daniel was going to die. He was going to rest in the earth. He was going to sleep the sleep of death. And he would stand in his lot, his appointed portion. He would receive his inheritance, his reward, at the end of the days. So all of these days end at the resurrection, the time when Daniel and all the other saints of God are going to arise from the earth. Now, we're told that an event that's going to happen 1,290 days, just 1 month more than 3.5 years prior to this time, is going to be a daily sacrifice that will be taken away, an abomination that will make desolate set up. Now, if we look back in verse 31 of Daniel 11, just back perhaps on the previous page in your Bible, you read once again of some of this. You read of a historic fulfillment. Daniel 11 is a story that develops through a very detailed prophecy of events in the Middle East over a period of several hundred years. We find up in verse 2 of Daniel 11, we start out with the kings of the Medes and the Persians and how the Greeks would come in and would overwhelm the Medo-Persian Empire, and how the Greek Empire would be split up among Alexander's generals, and then there would be two dominant ones that would emerge, called the king of the north and the king of the south. And the story of Daniel 11 progresses on from decade to decade through the ins and outs and maneuverings over a period of a couple of centuries that took place. We come down historically in the progression, and you can verify this. Virtually any commentary will take you through the historic progression of it. That we come on down to a man that is identified historically as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the king of the north, and he invaded Egypt and was turned away, verse 30, by the ships of Kittim, or the Roman fleet. This is in about 170 or so A.D., B.C., excuse me, a little over 170 years prior to the time of Christ. He was turned away by the Roman fleet that did not want to see him add Egypt to his empire, and he was upset, and we find that he came back through Judea, and in verse 31, arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that makes desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. I want to read you a little bit from a historical account that was written right around that time. It dates from the very time of the fulfillment of that prophecy. It is from the book of Maccabees, which was never intended to be part of the Bible, but it is a historical account. The Maccabees were a priestly family of the Jews, and were responsible for the cleansing of the temple afterward. But they, in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, it tells a little bit of the history here, that Antiochus Epiphanes became the king, and we're told, as it comes on down a little bit, that he entered proudly into the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof. We find also that King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen, all the nations, agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he would die. And so we find that in the 15th day of the month Kislev, which is the 10th month of the sacred calendar, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. And whosoever was found with any book of the testament, or if any consented to the law, the king's commandment was that they should be put to death. Now Antiochus had the idea, we're going to create one world, and the way we're going to do it is we're going to have one religion. And so a part of that was to abolish the religion of the people of God in Jerusalem. The daily sacrifice was stopped. The altar was desecrated by a hog being slaughtered and sacrificed on the altar. And a great statue of Jupiter Olympus, was set up in the Holy of Holies. Now, there is a kindred statue to that statue that is today located in a religious headquarters in Rome, Italy. It's the great statue that is today called the statue of St. Peter, but it was not originally the statue of St. Peter. It was an old Roman statue of Jupiter Olympus that dates back, almost 2 millennia. And it was rechristened. In fact, the scepter was literally cut out of the hand and the key was affixed to it to sort of change it up a little bit. And it's set up right now. Some of these things are simply matters of history. It's interesting. If you ever see a picture of the Vatican, you see the Vatican grounds, and right in the middle is this great giant obelisk. It looks sort of like the Washington Monument. Great giant obelisk right up there. You know where it came from? That was the great monument to the sun god. That's what it was built. It was the great obelisk in Heliopolis in Egypt. Heliopolis means the city of the sun. That was the great focal point of the worship of the sun god in Egypt. One of the great engineering feats of the ancient world was taking that thing down, transporting it on a fleet of Roman ships across the Mediterranean from Egypt up to Italy, bringing it to Rome, setting it up in the circus. And later on, the popes had it moved from the Roman circus over to the Vatican, made the center point there. And when you understand what it means and what it symbolizes, setting up right there at the headquarters of the great Mother Church, the great horror of Revelation 17, when you understand what the obelisk symbolizes, you realize it was a very fitting symbol there, the very symbol of the sun god. There's a lot of just ancient paganism that has been brought right in, that is set up, that's the very same thing that was utilized, that God said was an abomination way back when. The same thing has been brought in, dusted off. We call it something new now. Well, it's interesting. It talks about in Daniel 11, verse 45, about an individual who is going to plant the tabernacle of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end and none shall help him. It's going to be a removal of political and religious headquarters to Jerusalem. There are events that are going to take place in the Middle East. You can read in Zechariah 14 about how nations are going to come against Jerusalem to battle. The city will be taken. The houses rifled and the women ravished, and half the city will go into captivity. You can read about it in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 2. You read here of some of this, and he talks about a daily sacrifice being taken away and an abomination that will lead to desolation or destruction that's going to be set up. Now we find that what Antiochus did anciently, the Jews always called and referred to what Antiochus did as the abomination that made desolate. It was an abomination. It desecrated the altar of the temple of God. And here this individual who proclaimed himself to be God incarnate set up this great idol of Jupiter Olympus in the holy place. This individual, this Antiochus Epiphanes of history, that the Jews understood to be a fulfillment of these very words. But that was only the forerunner. That wasn't the real fulfillment. And the proof of that is in Matthew 24. Over 200 years after Antiochus had come along and done what he did, 200 years after those things had happened, Jesus Christ, speaking on the Mount of Olives outside Jerusalem in Matthew 24, verse 14. Now remember the question that had prompted all of the statements that Christ made in Matthew 24. The disciples came to him and they said, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So they had come to him with a specific question. What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of this age? And he began to go through certain things. And he said in Matthew 24:14, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations. Then shall the end come. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Oh, so what Antiochus did wasn't all there was. He said, "When you shall see," future, "the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. Whoso reads, let him understand. And let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them on the housetop not come down to take anything out. He says in verse 19, woe to them that are with child, to them that give suck in those days. Why? Verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation. That's going to be the onset of the great tribulation. The great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world of this time, no nor ever again shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there would no flesh be saved alive. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So we find that those things are going to occur. There's going to be a time of persecution and tribulation, just as there was. You know, Antiochus set this up because he was going to make this the headquarters of his false religion. He required, under penalty of death, that all go along and conform. He said, we need unity. We live in a world torn by strife. We live in a world torn by violence. And there are a lot of people that think, yes, we need unity. That's right, we need unity, but we need unity based on the truth. Not unity based on error or a lie. Unity that is based on the truth will endure. Unity that is based on a lie won't last till the water gets hot. It won't endure because it does not have the basis of endurance. Real unity has to be based on God and the truth of God if it's going to have staying power. So what do we find? That what happened, what Antiochus did, was a type. When you go back to the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation, chapter 13, he's gone through and he's been talking about this great feast that the description is taken from Daniel 7, the succession of world-ruling Gentile nations, Gentile empires, from Babylon down through Persia, through Greece, through Rome, and the various revivals of the Roman Empire, the Roman system in the West. But then he says, and he describes that in Revelation 13, and how this great creature of the Roman Empire received a deadly wound. It ended. And then, seemingly, that deadly wound was healed, and it was revived. And in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 11, he says, I saw another beast, another creature that came up out of the earth. This one had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. Now, horn in the Bible is symbolic of a government. So there are two governments here that are involved, two horns, two governments. One is civil and the other is religious. You know, an ecclesiastical government and a civil government. You know, the Vatican is both a nation state that has diplomatic recognition and diplomatic relations with nations all over the world. You know, the Baptist Church doesn't have diplomatic relations with churches all over the world. No other church, no other religious entity does, but the Vatican has diplomatic relations. They have ambassadors. They're accorded full diplomatic status because the Pope is not only the supreme religious leader of the Roman Catholic Church, he is the ruler of the Vatican City, which issues its own coins and its own stamps and is an independent enclave right there in Rome, not subject to Roman civil law or Italian civil law at all. So it's sort of the feeble remnant of what were once the papal states that encompassed all of central Italy. But he says, I saw this other beast coming up. It had two horns like a lamb. It was like a lamb, and yet it spoke as a dragon. So it claimed to represent, had the appearance of representing Christ, and yet the reality, what was really there, the substance of what was there, was it was not a godly system, it was a devilish system. It exercised all the power of the first beast, the old Roman Empire, and it caused the earth and those that dwelt therein to worship the first beast, to give their loyalty, their allegiance, their devotion to that Roman system, which is what happened all through the Middle Ages. As the Catholic Church insisted that its adherents give loyalty and allegiance and devotions to the revived Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. You see, the first beast whose deadly wound was healed, the first beast, the Roman Empire, when the deadly wound was healed, was thereafter known as the Holy Roman Empire. And we find that great wonders are done, lying miracles are done. We find that an image is constructed in verse 14, which describes, something that was a copy, a replica. The papal system was a copy, a replica of the old Roman imperial system. The whole structure and government and hierarchy of the Roman papal system was a copy, a replica, an image of the old Roman system, the old Roman Empire. And power was given it had power to give life to this image, to this hierarchy, this papal system, this governmental system, religious government, this religious government. And those who would not give their allegiance to that system were to be martyred. And that happened during the Middle Ages, and that will happen again. And all, small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, are caused here to receive a mark. Receive a mark. A brand of disobedience. All kind of crazy ideas going around. People say, well, let's call them like credit cards or Social Security cards or whatever. Well, that's silly, frankly. Why does God care whether you're using plastic or paper? Why is one some great brand of disobedience? God's horrified you're using plastic. Oh, no, you're going to die because you're using plastic. Paper is righteous. Well, paper is mediocre because metal is a little better. Well, it's ridiculous. All those things are simply mediums of exchange. Real wealth gold isn't real wealth. Real wealth comes out of the ground. You can have a pile of gold as big as this room. If you don't have any food to eat, you're going to die. You can't eat and live on the gold. The gold or the silver or the paper money or the plastic credit card or whatever it is only good if somebody will exchange to you the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter. Those things are only of value as long as somebody accepts them as a medium of exchange. And whether it's plastic or whether it's paper or whether it's metal coins in your pocket, whether it's copper, silver, or gold, is totally irrelevant. We're talking here of not something that is simply, not just, it's not the number on your license plate. People get buggy. That happened one time. I was in line at the license. Somebody was a license plate and it had the sequence, had several numbers on there, but the sequence 666 was on there. Boy, they wouldn't touch that thing. Well, we may make jokes about it, but that's not. If you get a license plate that somewhere in the sequence of numbers 666 appears, that's not going to. I know. Friend, a member in Houston, his address is 8666 Maple Crest Drive. Well, that doesn't make him the beast. That's not going to put him in mortal danger. It's talking about a brand of disobedience. It's talking about something that is a brand, a mark of disobedience to the law of God. We're told in Exodus 31 that God's Sabbath is a sign of obedience. It identifies the true God, and it identifies God's people. It is a sign of obedience. Just as the day of old Roman sun worship, enforced from the time of the Emperor Constantine on down, has been a brand, a mark imposed at various periods of history by law as a part of that system, there is coming a revival of a religious political alliance that is going to arise in Europe that will have worldwide implications. As we see certain events that are shaping up, we need to understand the times in which we're living. I don't have time to go into the prophecies relating to the church. I think a lot of the things we've gone through and things that we've seen even in the last year and more, we understand that a lot of these things we used to wonder. How will some of these things occur? How will the Laodicean church arise? Well, I think some of those things are a little more easy to understand now. But what we have to understand is what we need to do. Jesus said in Luke chapter 21 and verse 36, He said, "Watch you therefore, and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. We live in very eventful days. When we read what ultimately is going to come to pass, all those things haven't happened yet. Some of them we're obviously closer to, and others aren't. It's sort of like a stage. And the curtain has been rung down after the second act. We're in the intermission between the second and the third act, and the third and final act is going to occur, and the curtain will rise. Right now, the stage is being set. New props are being moved into place. But you know the stage doesn't have a spotlight on it when that's being done. You don't see all the rearrangements. You hear certain things and you hear certain noise. There are certain things going on. But the time is quickly coming when the curtain will rise and the stage will be set for the third and final act. Brethren, we're in the time right now when the stage is being set. Jesus Christ tells us to watch, to be alert, to be awake, to be watchful. And He tells us to pray always, to really walk with God. It doesn't do any good to know all the ins and outs of everything about prophecy, up and down and inside out and back and forth, if we're not walking with God, if we're not growing and overcoming in our own personal lives and really seeking to walk with God. We need to watch and we need to pray, so that we may be accounted worthy to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that shall never be removed. And brethren, we have the opportunity of being a part of that kingdom. We have the opportunity of being a part of that kingdom, and prior to the onset and the establishment of that kingdom, we have the opportunity to be a part of the final end-time work. We need to put our hearts into that. We need to put our hearts into our relationship with God, to be aware and awake and perceptive about the times in which we live, to realize that the stage is being set and the curtain will soon ring up for the third and final act, the human drama that is being played out here below. But God, the Most High, declares the end from the beginning. And if we seek Him and walk with Him, we will be a part of not simply the end, but a part of what will be the beginning of eternity.